Well, good afternoon. I'll present you in Portuguese and then I'll leave you. Eu queria apresentar a vocês aqui o professor Ha-Joon Chang, da Universidade de Cambridge, que vai fazer a conferência em Hamlet Without the Prince of Denmark, How Development Has Disappeared from Today's Development Discourse. E eu espero que todos estejam bem acomodados aqui no nosso Pedro Calmon, e eu vou passar a palavra para o Ha-Joon Chang.
Thank you, Director. Yeah, and I'm extremely happy to be here. You know, my very first visit to Brazil was to Rio back in 1997 when Ana Célia Castro and Leonardo Pulamaki organized this conference in November, to which I was invited. And then since then, I have been coming to Brazil quite often, but for some reason, I haven't been to Rio for the last 6-7 years, so it's really great to be back. Okay, so the paper I'm going to present to you is trying to discuss what we actually mean by development when we talk about development these days. Now, of course, can we go to the next slide? Of course, the definition of development has always been a contentious issue. So, since development economics was born as a subject from the 1930s, 40s in Brazil, in Eastern Europe, and so on, I mean, people have had many debates on what we mean by development. So I'm not going to try to settle that dispute today. But a lot of people would use income level as the sort of most basic indicator of development. But even most people who use that as an indicator would admit that development is something more than having more money, having higher material standard of living. So yes, income is very important, and income level is correlated with many things that are desirable in our lives, like life expectancy and low infant mortality and level of education and so on, but they are not perfectly correlated. So you see some countries where income is quite high, but there's, say, very high infant mortality because the distribution of income is really bad and public provision of health service and so on is really bad. You know, mothers are poorly educated and so on. So people have come up with indicators that try to measure this non-materialistic aspect of development, and the most popular of this is the so-called Human Development Index, developed by the UN agency UNDP. This basically tries to look at three things together: income, education level, and health indicators as reflected in life expectancy. And one important element in the construction of this index is that after a certain level, high income is not given any more weight. You know? So basically saying that up to a certain level, increase in material wealth is very important, but after that, it's not that important. And this is supported by many kind of surveys that have been done in the recent period. So if you ask people in rich countries whether they are happy or not, basically there's no correlation between the proportion of people saying yes and the level of the country's income. Yeah? So I mean, that intuitively is the appealing idea. So this, if you like, humanistic dimension of development, emphasized by indicators like the Human Development Index, has made a huge contribution in making us, well, constantly reminding us that material progress is only the means but not the end of development. So yes, that if we want a higher income is to provide better living standard, higher quality of living to people, not just for the sake of having more money. So that aspect is widely accepted, but there's another dimension that used to be central to the definition of development in the early days of development economics, but has become increasingly forgotten. And this is what I call the production side of development. Now, if you go back a bit, before the rise of neoliberalism since the late 1970s, there actually was a general consensus that development is largely about the transformation of the productive structure and, of course, the technological and organizational capabilities that support that structure, and also the transformation in social structure that result from those changes in productive structure. So with typically you need industrialization for development that changes not just the production structure, but also social structure in terms of higher degrees of urbanization, dissolution of the traditional family, changes in gender relationships, rise of labor movement, and so on. So there was a very clear dimension in the discourse on development, which is linked to production. Of course, there were many different opinions on how exactly this transformation of production structure was going to be achieved. But there was one consensus that covered everyone from Walt Rostow on the right and the dependency theorists on the left, which was that transformation in the production sphere is crucial for development. So the dependency theory said, okay, we have to sever link with the capitalist world system, launch a development program based on local knowledge and local technology, control over worker control over production process and all sorts of things. But they didn't deny that this was all for the sake of transforming the production structure. They even went as far as at least some of them, but went as far as saying that this is the genuine industrialization. It's not dependent on foreign capital, foreign control, and so on. And when you think about it, most of us still hold such view of development at a very instinctive level. So why do we, for example, refuse to classify countries like Qatar and Brunei and these oil-rich economies as developed countries? In terms of pure income level, Qatar is by far the richest country in the world. Brunei is as rich as many European countries. But then we refuse to classify them as developed. You may call them high income, but you refuse to call them developed because you implicitly believe that achieving high income through having a lot of resources is not development. It has to be achieved through the transformation in your production structure. It cannot happen by simply sitting on a lot of natural resources and inviting the French and the Americans and the Japanese to come and get those out of ground and then earn a lot of money. Another example is, at the end of the Second World War, the income level in per capita terms in Germany fell to that of Peru and Mexico. But no one suggested that Germany at that time should be reclassified as a developing country, because people knew that Germany still had the necessary technologies and organizational capabilities to regain its pre-war level of income quickly, which it did in about 10 years. Yeah? I mean, of course, if you killed enough Germans, that this wouldn't have happened, but people recognize that the society still was in possession of this technological and organizational knowledge, which will allow it to regain its previous level of productive capabilities quite quickly. And that's why no one even suggested that Germany should be reclassified as a developing country. So these examples show that we are implicitly saying that in order to qualify as developed, an economy's high income should be based on superior knowledge embodied in technologies and institutions, rather than simple command over resources. Now that, however, has actually changed a lot, because during the last quarter of a century, development has come to mean something quite different. Now, if you read various documents, coming out from the World Bank, the OECD, the Inter-American Development Bank, the NGO world, the United Nations, WTO, development has basically come to mean poverty reduction, provision of basic needs, and provision of better education and health to individuals, all based on the maintenance of existing productive structure according to the logic of comparative advantage. Essentially, development has come to mean anything but development in the traditional sense. Yeah? And this is why I call this Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. Yeah? For those of you who haven't read Hamlet, like I haven't, Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark. But if you write a play called Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark, what is it? I mean, it's nothing. Yeah? Anyway, so in this talk, I want to discuss how the use of very concept called development in today's mainstream development discourses has become devoid of a real sense of development. So I'll discuss a number of things like the Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations, the Doha Development Agenda of the WTO, and the recently popular discourses on microfinance, to show that the currently dominant vision of development lacks a vision of transformation in productive structure, and consequently cannot really promote development in the real sense, and can even sometimes be anti-developmental. Let me explain what I mean by this. Now, as you all know, since the rise of neoliberalism, many people in the rich countries, both inside and outside the academia, have come to take the view that developing countries are poor only because of their own inabilities and corruption, and therefore the rich countries have no moral obligations to help them. Yeah? So there are now a lot of people in America and Europe calling for an end to foreign aid. Yeah? Now, fortunately, at least until now, this view is not the dominant view. And most people still believe that with a strong help from the rich countries, the developing countries can pull themselves out of poverty. And the most progressive, if you like, and comprehensive of this type of thinking is arguably embodied in the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So this is an agenda made up of 8 goals. It's actually quite a lot more complicated because each goal has targets. So for example, Goal 7, ensure environmental sustainability, it also includes targets on safe drinking water and sanitation. So each goal is made up of a number of sub-goals or targets. So it's not as simple as you see there, but basically most of the elements of this Millennium Development Goals or MDGs relate to reducing poverty and improving education and health. I mean, up to goal 6 is obvious. It's about poverty, about hunger, about providing better health care, better education. But even goal 7 includes some of this, as I said earlier, because 2 of the targets under goal 7 are improving access to safe drinking water and increasing access to improved sanitation. Now, all these goals are laudable. I mean, I have no problem with these goals. But doing all these, is that going to achieve development, at least in the sense that we talked about earlier? That's not the case. I mean, that this is basically maintaining the given structure and providing a bit more to individuals, and it contains no notion of fundamental transformation of the underlying economic and social structures. Now, the only explicitly kind of development-oriented goal is actually goal 8. Next slide, please. Which is made up of these elements. As you will see there, basically this is made up of the trinity of increased aid, debt reduction, and increased international trade. Now, debt reduction and increased aid, unless they're on a massive scale, are simply enabling conditions. Simply by giving more aid and canceling debt, you are not going to promote development. So here the essence is really the development of what this calls the open, rule-based, predictable, non-discriminatory trading system. And this system is, next slide please, essentially a trading system where the rich countries reduce their tariffs and subsidies on things that developing countries, especially the least developed countries, export, like agriculture, textile, and clothing. So a lot of initiatives have been launched along this line. So the American government launched something called AGOA, which basically gives tariff-free access to U.S. market to poor African countries. And the Europeans launched, what's it called, the ABA, Anything But Arms, the initiative where once again poor countries are given duty-free access to the European market. So basically, the message is that you have to, as they say, trade your way out of poverty. So sell more of your agriculture, sell more of your textiles, and that way you will earn more money and become rich. Well, richer. Yeah? But in this vision, there's no notion that developing countries need to actually get out of what they are doing now. I mean, their specialization in those very activities is what keep these countries poor. And there's there's no objection to that, but no recognition that getting out of those activities and moving into higher productive activities may need something more than rich countries saying, yeah, you can sell more of your textiles and your agricultural products. And indeed, doing more of the same thing in terms of one's productive activities is definitely not how today's developed countries have become developed. And I have talked about this in many of my writings, like the books Kicking the Ladder and Bad Samaritans, both of which have been translated in Brazil into Portuguese. We will have... Now, don't get me wrong. By saying these, I'm not implying that all forms of, say, traditional activities like agriculture or textile are incompatible with development. For example, the Netherlands, it has the 5th highest population density in the world. So the land is the last thing they have. Despite that, it's the 3rd largest exporter of agriculture because they produce a lot of very high quality agricultural products. Until the early 1990s, not anymore, but until the early 1990s when the German wage level were already very high, Germany was the 5th largest exporter of textile and clothing. Now, of course, these countries could do that only because they used high technologies to do these things. So in Netherlands, if you don't have enough land, well, you don't grow things on land. You basically grow things in water. So you build greenhouses, you have these shelves which have a water bed, you grow plants in there, and they are fed very high quality chemicals produced by companies like AXO. And the feeding amount and time is controlled by computer equipment produced by companies like Philips. That's how they do their agriculture. Germany remained the major exporter of textile and clothing by upgrading their design. Probably, if someone talked about German fashion design in the say 1970s, a lot of people might have laughed. Oh, Germans are good at producing machines, but fashion design. But a lot of designers and design companies today are German. Karl Lagerfeld and Hugo Boss and all these people. They also develop specialty textiles. So things like Gore-Tex. It's not German, that's American, but something like those. So these examples show that it's not what you produce, but how you produce it that matters more. But in that how, you have this concept of productive transformation. And the reason why I mentioned the Philippines is, if you look at the World Bank Development Report, annual report, they used to have like 40 tables at the end, which were very useful. Now they have only like 5 tables, which quite restrict the kind of information that you can easily get. Anyway, but there's one very interesting number which anyone hardly mentions, which is the share of high-tech exports in each country's manufactured export. And on that indicator, the Philippines is number one. 70% of its exports are high-tech exports. Of course, despite that, the Philippines still is a poor country with $2,000 per capita income. Why? Because they do it with other people's technology, under other people's management. So it's the Americans and the Japanese and the Koreans who come there, set up the factories, give them the materials. The Filipinos just put things together. So even though they have very high-tech indicator, they end up being a very poor country. So that example is there. But basically what I'm trying to tell you with these examples is that without the transformation in productive structure and the accompanying transformation in your technologies and organizations, real development cannot happen. And for that reason, MDGs remain what I call development without development. It's called development, but there is no real development. Okay, the next two slides are just advertisement of my books. So can we just quickly go through them and move to real slide? More, yeah. Okay, and then we come to what I call anti-developmental development agenda of the Doha Development Agenda. Now, the non-developmental nature of MDGs we have talked about is bad enough, but unfortunately, the dominant development discourse becomes positively anti-developmental when it comes to the so-called DDA, or the Doha Development Agenda. This was kind of trade negotiation round launched in November 2001 by George W. Bush in the Doha ministerial talk of the WTO. Now it has quite a few elements, but the core of it is what we can describe as the agriculture industry swap. Basically, the idea is that, well, why don't we help developing countries by liberalizing agricultural trade in the rich countries, and in return, the developing countries lower their tariffs on industrial products. And this is going to be really good for the developing countries because they can export what they are good at, agriculture, but also, their industrial producers tend to be quite inefficient. I mean, they survive only because they are protected by tariffs and so on. So if you get rid of those, these countries' consumers will be able to import cheaper industrial products, which is also good for them. This is called the NAMA negotiations, or non-agricultural market access negotiation, because the focus is basically how you give more access to developed country producers to the non-agricultural markets of developing countries. Now, the first trouble with this vision is that this agriculture industry swap is not going to help development very much, even if you define it in the anodyne MDG sense. Because many developing countries are actually not exporters of agriculture. They are net importers. And liberalizing agricultural trade in the rich countries, basically reducing tariffs and subsidies, may actually hurt these countries, at least in the short run, because some of these countries import a lot of subsidized agricultural products from the rich countries. So if they cannot, they have to pay now for these things at world market price, they will actually have trouble importing enough food, and that could directly hit the MDG goals like reducing hunger and improving health. But more importantly, the main beneficiaries of the opening of agriculture markets in the developed world are going to be other developed countries with strong agriculture. The United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And this is actually estimated, even by the World Bank and the WTO, that between 70 to 75% of the gains of agricultural liberalization in the rich countries are going to go to these 4 countries. The point is that the most developing countries actually export agriculture products that are not protected by the developed countries for the simple reason that they do not produce any of those. So which European country has that tariff on coffee? They don't have any local producer to protect, so they don't have protection against those things. So the agriculture product protection and subsidies in the rich countries are mainly focused on so-called temperate products, basically wheat, dairy, and so on. And only 2 developing countries, Brazil and Argentina, are the main exporters of these products. So if you liberalize agriculture in the rich countries, only Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay in the developing group are going to benefit from it. And the main victims of this will be actually these small farmers in countries like Japan, Norway, and Switzerland. Of course, these are rich people by global standard. But I'm not sure whether I want to tell these people to go to hell so that some big agri-business company in the United States and Argentina, Australia can earn more money, or some big landlord in Brazil and Argentina become richer. People often have this idea that, if you do this industry agriculture swap, all these poor farmers in Ghana will become better off, and this is good for those people. Actually, they are not the main beneficiaries. The main beneficiaries are the companies like the Monsanto and Cargill and so on in the United States, rich landlords in Argentina and Brazil. So what development are we talking about here? Next slide, please. But more importantly, in the long run, the Doha development agenda is actually likely to hinder rather than help development by making it structurally very difficult for developing countries to transform their productive capabilities. Because the price that the developing countries are being asked to pay is the reduction in their industrial tariffs. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, reduction in industrial tariffs in these countries may bring some benefit to the consumers in the developing countries by making better products available, but even according to the estimate of the World Bank and so on, that this is unlikely to be more than the equivalent of 1.5% of developing country GDP. And this is one-off gain. Don't forget. It's not like every year once you open, yes, that your welfare increase, and then it stays at that level. Moreover, these short-term gains are likely to be quickly overwhelmed by the long-term losses that come from the inability to promote infant industry. Indeed, if the rich countries have their way in the NAMA negotiations and force developing country industrial tariffs down to 5 to 7%, their industrial tariffs will be at the lowest level since the days of colonialism and unequal treaties. So, for example, in the 19th century and early 20th century, a lot of countries, developing countries, were colonies, so they had no ability to set their own tariffs. But even for politically independent countries, for example, the Latin American countries, China, Thailand, and so on, they were forced to sign what are known as unequal treaties, which basically deprives the weaker country of the right to set their own tariffs. So this is why throughout most of the first 70, 80 years of independence, tariffs in Latin America was between 3 and 5%. So if you reduce tariffs to the level that the rich countries want, they will go down to basically 5 to 7%, which means that they'll be lowest ever since the end of colonialism. Also, the context in which the industrial tariff cuts are to be made magnifies their potential negative impacts, because in the last 15 years, through the WTO and various bilateral and regional free trade agreements, a lot of instruments of industrial policy have become illegal. So countries cannot use quotas anymore. The use of subsidies are very highly restricted. There's a lot of restriction on how countries can restrict foreign investment. And paradoxically, despite the fact that mainstream trade economists keep saying that economically speaking, subsidies are always better than tariffs, tariffs have become basically the only tools of industrial policy left for developing. So even if you have the same degree of tariff cuts, the impact is likely to be much bigger today than in the, say, 60s and 70s, when countries had many other tools of industrial policy. Now, tariff is the only thing that's left that is major, and then they are trying to get rid of it. Also, to make it even worse, the tariff cuts are supposed to be made in a manner that is much more stringent than before, because, for example, in the Uruguay round that ended in the launch of the WTO, countries were, of course, required to cut tariffs, but they were required to cut only average tariffs. They had to set some ceilings above which they wouldn't raise their tariff, but within that boundary, it was up to the country whether they protect one sector very strongly and another sector very little. But in the NAMA negotiations, they are applying what is known as a Swiss formula. I don't know why it's called Swiss formula, but basically the idea is that tariffs have to be cut line by line. Every line of tariff has to be cut, and also higher tariffs will be cut more steeply. So this means that the developing countries are not even going to have the freedom to protect some key sectors while cutting tariffs in others. A lot of countries have done this. I mean, for example, in the late 19th century, the average industrial tariff for Belgium was only about 10%. But for some textile industries, the tariff was 80%. For the steel industry, it was 60%. Average was 10% because there were a lot of sectors that had no protection. But with this new formula, that kind of the combination is not possible. If your tariff is average 7%, basically it will have to be between 0 and 10%. So this is why I say that the Doha Development Agenda is not simply non-developmental like the MDGs, but it is deeply anti-developmental because it is going to make it very difficult, if not totally impossible, for developing countries to transform their underlying production structure. Okay, having said all these, it would be unfair to suggest that there is no attempt whatsoever to increase productive capabilities in the currently dominant vision of development. Can we go to the next slide? After all, the improvements in health and education emphasized by the MDGs, for example, should increase the productive capabilities of individuals. And when individual productive capabilities increase, it is likely, although not certain, that the overall productive capabilities of the economy increases. But my problem is that there's a limit to how much your productive structure can be transformed purely based on this individual betterment. I'll explain that. And the same applies to microfinance, which is based on this idea that by giving very small loans to poor people, you let them open business and they pull themselves out of poverty. And given the sort of entrepreneurial energy that is kind of there in developing countries, this is going to be a major agent of development. Now, we can talk about this microfinance idea about which I'm very critical, actually, in greater detail in the question and answer session if you want, but let's see what I have problems with in these kind of things. Now, don't get me wrong, at one level, there's nothing wrong with this. I mean, making people healthier, educating them more, I mean, it's good. I mean, good in itself. It's also good for your production because you are producing healthier and more skilled workers. Entrepreneurship that is supposed to be promoted by things like microfinance is an important, if not the only force behind the increase in a country's productive capabilities. So, I'm not arguing against business loans to poor people or giving them better education per se. But can we go to the next slide? But my contention is that there are only so many productive capabilities that can be developed through improvement at the individual level. Because development in productive capabilities in reality mainly occurs in productive enterprises. However well-educated and healthy the individuals may be, they cannot produce rapid, lasting, and sustainable productivity growth that makes development possible unless they are employed by firms engaged in production activities with large scope for productivity increase. And even if the total number and the capabilities of the individuals involved are the same, more and better ideas will be produced by individuals working together in a productive enterprise because there will be cross-fertilization of ideas. Also, much of the knowledge in productive enterprises is acquired in a collective manner, in the sense that they are created in the context of a complex division of labor and deposited in the forms of organizational routines and institutional memories. This is why even if some people leave a company, the company runs. So to put it a bit more provocatively, I would say that what really distinguishes the US or Germany on the one hand from the Philippines or Nigeria on the other hand are their Boeings and Volkswagens, the companies that make Boeings and Volkswagens, and not their economists or medical doctors. As it happens, the Philippines and Nigeria produce a lot of very highly qualified medical doctors and economists. Only that most of them drive taxis in New York. Similarly, what really distinguishes Ecuador or Vietnam from Sweden or Japan is not the raw entrepreneurial energy of the people that the promoters of microfinance praise, which is probably more widespread in poor countries, but the abilities of the society to set up and manage productive enterprises that can channel that individual energy into raising productivity. This is why, for example, you very rarely hear of the Japanese or the Swedish equivalent of Steve Jobs or the Bill Gates, but Japan and Sweden are as rich and as productive as the United States, because they have this productive organizations that channel all these innovative capabilities and entrepreneurial energy into a systematic effort. So this is why I call what little developmentalism that there is in the currently dominant vision of development, ersatz developmentalism. Basically, the idea that if you educate people more, make them healthier, give them security of property rights, and perhaps a small loan, all these rational, self-seeking individuals will exercise their natural tendency to truck and barter, as Adam Smith would have put it, and somehow create a prosperous economy. But I argue that development actually requires a lot of collective and systematic efforts at acquiring and accumulating better productive knowledge through the construction of better organizations, cross-fertilization of ideas within them, and the channeling of individual entrepreneurial energy into collective entrepreneurship. Okay, so the next slide, please. To conclude, I argue that the currently dominant development discourse have completely failed to deliver any lasting development in the last 2-3 decades in which they were dominant. So we need to go back to what I call the productionist tradition of all development economics and the transformation in productive capabilities that go beyond individuals back at the heart of our development thinking. Of course, by saying that, I'm not suggesting that we can simply dust off our Celso Frutado and Albert Hirschman and solve every problem. No. I mean, we need to consider additional dimensions that these earlier development economies were not unaware of, but were not didn't go deep into discussing. So going back to the productionist tradition should not mean that we focus only on material aspects of development. As I implied earlier, the early development economies were also aware of non-materialistic dimensions. Otherwise, they wouldn't have debated on what is the meaning of development. They would have simply measured it through per capita income. No, they didn't do that. But it is true that the earlier development economies that focus more on the materialistic aspects, and therefore we need to pay more attention to humanistic dimensions of development. Secondly, political economy issues need to be more explicitly considered. It is not true that the early development, this is a frequent accusation by neoliberal economists. They say, oh, the early development economists didn't think about politics. They thought the governments in developing countries are the modern equivalent of Plato's philosopher king. They had very naive notion of politics. That's actually not true. If you read, for example, of all people, Paul Kuznets, the guy who invented national accounting and the inverted U curve and so on. You think he's a boring national accountant, but actually when you read his writings, you will see that he was very aware of the political changes that accompany economic development. And one of the reasons why he thought inequality will decline with industrial development was the rise of working class movement and the development of welfare state and so on. It's actually not true that these people didn't think about politics, but yes, that it is also true that they probably didn't pay as much attention as necessary. So we need to highlight that. Also, institutions, of course, institutions were at the center of all development discourse in the sense that the very reason why these people thought you needed different kind of economics for developing countries was because they were acutely aware that the difference in institutions in these countries produce different type of social structure, different kinds of individual behaviors and so on. So the institutions were there, but once again, institutional analysis were not fully developed in the old traditions, so we need to develop that further. Also, development economists of the old vintage, if you like, did not pay much attention to the process of technological development in the process of productive transformation. And the productive transformation was seen mainly in terms of capital accumulation and the transfer by investable surplus and labor force from the traditional sector to the modern sector. And the issue of technology was not fully explored. And we really need to put this issue of technological development at the heart of transformative strategy. So the technology issues, in relation to technology issues, you cannot give as much credit as you can to the old school development economists that in relation to things like politics and institutions. There was quite weak discussion of technology issues. Having said that, the mainstream economists that have even less sophisticated notion of technology, so probably in comparative terms they were quite okay, but it is becoming absolutely essential that we consider these technological aspects more carefully. Last but not least, environmental sustainability was more or less ignored in the old-style development economics for the simple reason that it wasn't an issue. Now we are acutely aware, so we need to take this issue of environmental sustainability into account in developing a new, if you like, a development discourse. So developing and enriching the traditional protectionist perspective on development with the addition of these additional elements is necessary, but of course it's not going to be easy. But unless we develop this alternative discourse, the future of development is really bleak, because if you have these people dominate the discussion who think developing countries should agriculture products. The only thing we need to do is to give them more education and more health. Okay, maybe a bit of microcredit, and then problem of development is solved. Then, unfortunately, there will be no development in developing countries, I can tell you. Okay, let me stop there and invite you to ask me any question you might have and make any comment you might have. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here among many friends, and especially my good friend. I was afraid to say old friend. It's not old at all, but we're friends for a long time. My good friend, Ha-Joon Chung. Always very nice to hear what he has to say on any topic. And when I read the paper, I became a little bit scared because I didn't have anything to actually disagree in terms of what was said by Ha-Joon. Then I start thinking, and by the very end, when he talks about the new developmentalism or the contours, then I managed to come up with some ideas, some elements that I think that may serve for starting our discussion. And those would be observations, let me say, on what was not mentioned by Ha-Joon when he talks about the contours, what should be the main contours of a new developmentalism. So I will point to 6 themes very, very superficially, very quickly, because the only thing in between your questions to Ha-Joon and his answers is me, so I don't want to stay in the middle for a long time. And let me invite you to think about those observations as just something to get the ball rolling, okay? Okay, first point, so 6 points. First point would be finance and development and finance versus development. Well, if we go back to Schumpeter, the theory of economic development, old school, maybe, I don't know. We go back to Schumpeter and we fast forward to Minsky. Schumpeter, credit and innovation are the basic fundamental sources for development. Okay, so to think about development, one should also be thinking about finance from the beginning, from the start. But then we fast forward to Minsky, and we have a different kind of proposition, which is that capitalism is essentially a financial system, and a system which is prone to financial innovations which are mostly destabilizing. In that sense, we have another proposition, not on finance being only key to development, but the possibility of finance being also extremely anti-development. And we just saw that, we're seeing that in the US, we're seeing that in the Eurozone, and if you want, we could compare Brazil and South Korea trajectories from that perspective. In a way, in Brazil, we had development, but we also had for almost all the golden developmental period, we had periods and periods and periods of financial fragility. Korea did have that, but in a much lesser extent. So that would be, for me, an interesting topic, well, a crucial topic to pose at and try to investigate. So, question I would make on that point is how to place that into a new developmentalism. My hint is that we need a financially backed theory of structural or technological change. It's not technological change alone. It's a financial theory of technological change, or if you will, a monetary theory of production, which was what Keynes also suggested, even before 36 and after 36. My hint would be that my start-up question in that regard, or on that perspective, would be the following, and I would be very much Minskian in that question. Capitalism, I understand it as, well, following Minsky, as always and essentially a financial system. The question is, in which conditions it also becomes an innovation system? It's not automatic. It requires a lot. It requires a lot of what Rajun talked, but that's a crucial question. I don't think that the question has been very well answered. Second point, the global dimension versus developmental prospects, meaning the challenges, the constraints, and the opportunities posed by the global. Well, what is the global? Again, I'm going to get to the best example I can come up with, which is financial globalization. Well, you think about financial globalization, obviously you have to think about financial flows, interest and exchange rate volatilities, liquidity creation, financial layering, and building up financial fragility on a global scale. In that sense, I would say it's crucial to think about robust, solid, effective financial governance. And that's, again, something that we're seeing right now in our days. So what's the relationship in between financial governance on a global scale, well, including, of course, domestic financial government, but financial governance and development prospects? Well, obviously, especially in a deregulated global financial environment, which is the one that we live right now. And, well, I could go back, again, Minsky, Jan Kregel, Randall Wray, Henry Kaufman, Andrew Sheng, and the financial Keynesianism in general. So that's the second point. What are the new tasks for the state in that regard? How much does it matter to have a robust public financial system? That's a question that I would say, in my view, is another very important question for any thinking about a new developmentalism. My third point refers to knowledge, law, and development. And by that, I mean that it's quite clear, I think, for all of us, at least in this room, that the current system of intellectual property rules and regulations does not help very much the democratization of access to knowledge. On the contrary, it tends to create some sort of information feudalism. It's a legal system that works largely against development. It creates fortunes for corporations and individuals, but it doesn't really bring development in the sense of innovation diffusion, not innovation creation. So, the question I pose here is, shouldn't a new developmentalism seek for a system of governing the creation, diffusion, and protection of knowledge oriented towards the public interest instead of the private interest and private corporations alone? And of course, Rajun discussed NAMA, and I think the discussion was very good, very much to the point. But there are other treaties, like GATS, which is mostly about financial stuff, but also TRIPS Plus under WTO, and the bilateral trade agreements that he also mentioned briefly. And I think that they are even more harmful than NAMA for thinking about or crafting developmental strategies. Fourth point, I have 6, so 4, 5, and 6, and I'll be done. Competition. I think we, both mainstream and heterodox, whatever, nobody has a very good theory of competition. We don't have a fully developed theory of competition, and that's per se a problem for a theory of development, because development should also be about how competition works. I'm not going to go far in that direction right here, but so for the purpose of this discussion, I would like to point to the relationship in between industrial policy and competition policies. Very badly explored, I think, that relationship. And why is that? Because industrial policy, totally insulated from competition, does not work well. We know that. Calibration and fine-tuning are required and are very difficult to achieve. And again, Brazil and South Korea could be a very interesting case in terms of how Korea managed to keep much more competition going. All Brazil got an industrial policy, but more or less insulated firms in a way that it worked, but it didn't work that well. So there is a analytical and concrete puzzle there to be investigated, and I think that this again should be a topic for a new developmentalism, and again the state should be brought in for that, meaning what's the proper role of the state in calibrating the relationship in between industrial policy and competition, again in a global environment. The issue for further discussion that I leave you with is that if we depart, it's a suggestion, if we depart from a Schumpeterian competition perspective to analyze development and understand, and if we understand development as an as unpredictable structural change, I think we should end up with development as a leapfrogging process instead of development as catching up process. I leave you with that idea. Institutions, indeed, obviously, they should be much more prominent in a contemporary reframing of development theory, obviously. But my candidate in that front would not be, well, Hajun talks about inequality as an example, and I think inequality is quite an important theme. I agree with that. I'm just going to be suggesting another topic which I think is, again, something that is not explored at all in our corners of economic thinking, which is the relationship in between law and markets. Specifically, how markets really work. And I ask myself, would this be a sort of a Polanyian link? I'm not so sure, maybe. But my point is that markets are first and foremost legal entities. They're not economic entities in the first place, they're legal. Why is that? Because they are webs of legal contracts which bound supply and demand and generate debt and credit relationships, and those relationships bind the players. So we're talking about a legal environment before we start to think or talk about how the markets actually work. And if you agree with that, if we start from that perspective, then markets are simply not well understood, neither by mainstream nor by the old or new developmentalism. So a new framework should develop quite some energy to that matter. The sixth point, and I'll close. China. Well, and China in the sense that, let me recall my dear mentor, Antonio Castro, who used to say, the world will have to adapt to China, not the reverse. So, my point here is that any suggested new developmentalism should not have China as another Asian success story only. Of course, that's a fact. But China as a major area of focus for development theory from a global perspective. China is, at the same time, a set of challenges, opportunities, and interrogation marks for framing development strategies. But how do we deal with that analytically? I think that's a question that's not only empirical or historical, it's mostly analytical. And to close, two minor observations, minor. First one I would call deference. Well, given Hajun's title of the paper and the conference he just delivered, I would expect a reference to Schumpeter. Why? Because Schumpeter ends chapter 7 of Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy precisely with that. Hamlet without the prince. So, in terms of deferring to some of the best in the old tradition, I would expect a reference there. Second point would be references. I think mainstream thinks about elegance in terms of neat models which can be pretty dumb, but they're elegant because they close. I don't think we want to follow that fashion school for elegance here, but let me propose as a closing and a little bit joking but a little bit provocative as well, let me propose a rule of thumb for us heterodox fellows. Let's not quote ourselves more than everybody else we refer to in our papers. And I'm done. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
This question? I don't know how to do it. I mean, I can respond to them, but maybe that we can collect a few more questions.
Everybody wants to ask
yeah.
questions to Hajun.
Maybe try to answer them in common themes.
Hi. I think we can all agree that today South Korea is much more developed than Brazil. And maybe if we look back to the 70s, I think both countries were quite similar in productive structure and productivity. The media in Brazil spreads the knowledge that South Korea developed through education. Other specialists, like Alice Amsden, points out the importance of the South Korean state. What was the letter that you, as a South Korean, can point as the most important letter that took South Korea to a better place than Brazil?
Okay.
Let me change, my question changes the topic a little bit from the policy orientation to thinking about economic development and the history of economic development as a discipline. And I will first excuse myself for being a very rude, blunt, and abrupt American in the way that I phrased the question. As I understand your argument, this sort of change from the shift away from concern with productive structure does very much change the development debate, both academically and from a policy perspective. Certainly from a political perspective, and here is where I can be very rude, as I understand your argument, by shifting development studies away from understanding and changing productive structures, we've made it very easy for policymakers to institute neoliberal policies. So that the shift has, whether intent or outcome, very, very fundamental policy implications.
Yeah.
But I would go back to the question about the history of development economics itself, which really sort of coalesced in the post-World War II period. And by the beginning of strongly neoliberal periods, kind of broadly thinking, I'm wondering if development policy and development economics was in fact faced with a real big problem of being considered a failed discipline, simply because it did not do what changes in productive structure or changes in human development indices might have promoted, which would be broad-based improvement of human circumstances. And there was a 40 or 50 year period that demonstrated that a small number of economies, in fact, did benefit, but the majority did not. And so those original policies may have been called into question. So then the shift towards this broad-based consensus of human condition variables, that, if we want to use that phrase, was in reaction against what might be considered an earlier failure. And so then what you're doing, it seems to me, is actually more incorporating both of these trajectories by focusing on institutions and focusing on some of these millennium goals. In fact, what you're trying to do is not so much overturn one as much as integrate the two of them. So then, first of all, A, am I correct in that interpretation? And B, what would you say about this idea of the failure of original developmentalism? I'm sorry to have gone on so long.
Good evening, sir. My question comes from wondering, why do economists legitimate and support this anti-development agenda, you know? And I guess my question also have some reference with what Professor Bulamaki said. When we aim to analyze the methodological structure of traditional economic theory, I guess we perceive a lot of limitations because of the scientific charge of the economic method. And my question is this: do you see in Cambridge and other universities more versatility in the new formulations of economic models, or the tendency still is this very hard scientific language that maybe restricts our analysis and makes us make a poor judgment? And also, if we are conceiving and maybe considering a different framework, if a more interdisciplinary approach would be functional to enrich of meaning the concept of development. Because I don't know if I'm wrong, but we still seem pretty much dependent. We depend a lot on the validity, the replicability of the results that we produce, and this could imply in a loss of meaning of the economic language. So if you could...
Yep. Important and stimulating comments. First, in relation to some of the broad things that Leonardo mentioned, yes, I mean, finance is an element that should be included. I mean, I don't know whether I would necessarily go as far as talking about monetary theory of production, but I mean, no question that, especially in this world, that it is absolutely central in understanding how things work. And yes, I mean, that finance, both finance for development or finance against development, I mean, those are very good formulations. But other things, I mean, it probably also extends beyond development economics. I mean, we could talk about developing a more general theory of competition and cooperation that applies not just to development areas, but also other areas of economics. I would go a step even further than you in talking about markets and about legal things before they are economic things. I would go one step further and argue that markets are actually political things, because in the end, politics is what defines law. So, I mean, no dispute with any of the themes that you have raised, probably except for China. I mean, I don't know whether it's a theoretical problem or an empirical problem, so we can leave that aside, but I very much thank you for raising all these important points. Now, on the second question first, what am I trying to do? I mean, I don't know. I mean, that maybe it's that kind of Hegelian or Marxian thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, because I certainly take those, if you like, neoclassical or neoliberal critiques of early development economics very seriously. And, I mean, that you need to take those criticisms seriously. The resulting product may look like, I don't know, in some sense, going back to the old tradition, or as you describe, synthesis of different traditions. I mean, I don't really care what it is described as, but when there are kind of things that a particular group of people haven't really carefully looked at, you need to develop them. So, in that sense, I mean, you could call this a synthesis. Now, did early development economics fail? I mean, that depends on what you mean by failure. I mean, what are you comparing these with? I mean, because, for example, in the 1960s and 70s, sub-Saharan African economies grew at about 1.6% in per capita terms. You could call that say that that's very low, but that's higher than what Europe and America achieved during the Industrial Revolution, at which point they grew between 1 and 1.5%. So was that a failure? Yes. I mean, it looks like a failure because there were other countries like South Korea and Taiwan or Singapore that were growing at 6%. Compared to that, it's a failure, but by long historical standard, it wasn't such a failure. And also it's not clear whether, what Korea did or Ghana did or whichever country did was necessarily direct the translation of early developing economics. I mean, certainly Korean policymakers did retrenchment, talked about linkages, but also many of them are deeply influenced by Marxism and the Soviet industrialization experience, which also had impact on development economics. I mean, very few people know this, but the PhD thesis and very first book of Amartya Sen was basically that simple mathematical model justifying Stalin's economic policy. I mean, basically arguing that you need to use the production techniques which are more capital intensive than is dictated by neoclassical theory in order to maximize surplus and in order to maximize investment and maximize growth. So, exactly what was the development theory that people use, that's also not clear. But having said all this, yes, it's true that there were dissatisfaction with the earlier relatively simplistic view of how economies develop, ignoring issues of technological development, finance, and many other things. So, and that we need to improve upon those things. Now, then we can get into a more deeper methodological problem. I mean, why do economists support what I call at least anti-development agenda? And you could say that this is deeply rooted in mainstream economic theory, because in that theory, we are basically seeing the world through the eyes of the consumer. also that even more problematic is this view that economics is actually about rational choice. It's not about the economy. No, really, I mean, if you read, say, free economics, I mean, there's very little about economics in the book, as the authors themselves acknowledge, because this is basically following in the tradition going back to Gary Becker, and then before that, people like Lionel Robbins, who defined economics as a study of rational choice, essentially. It's very peculiar because all other subjects are defined, all other disciplines are defined by the area of inquiry. So chemistry is about chemicals, biology is about living things, but economics is not about the economy. No, seriously, I mean, and what is the economy? I mean, it's essentially about how we produce and provision for human needs. And because it's about rational choice about everything, I mean, the production doesn't have the primacy that it had in older economic theory. What was the very first thing that Adam Smith wrote about in his book? It was a factory. He didn't talk about banking, he didn't talk about money, he wrote about the factory. So at least in the old days, you had this notion that economics is about the economy, the center of the economy is in the production sphere. That notion is gone. So for these people, why should it matter whether some country becomes richer by finding more oil or producing better microchips or doing it with someone else's technologies and so on. So I think there's a deeper methodological problem there. And in that sense, this talk of interdisciplinarity has a limit, because there are many economists who would actually think that economics can cover everything. I mean, my friend Ben Fine has written about this quite a lot. Recently produced with this Greek economist Milonakis a book called From Economics Imperialism to Free Economics. Basically talking about this tendency that economics can explain the subject matters of sociology, psychology, politics, everything better than all these other disciplines. So try and talk to these people about interdisciplinary study. They would laugh at you. They say, oh, well, so-called sociology and so on is just low-grade economics applied to certain things that these people think are their own turf, but we can do it better. So there's a very serious methodological problem there. And finally, the one on Korea and Brazil, in 1961, Brazil was actually 50% richer than South Korea. So today, South Korea is 2.5 times richer than Brazil. But there was a time in the 60s and 70s when Korea was growing at 6%, Brazil in per capita terms, Brazil was growing at 4.5%, so it was nearly comparable. But we have this huge difference. One important difference is finance, as Leonardo implied. In that story, I think the one critical difference was the emphasis that the Koreans put on export. Because the problem with Brazil and many Latin American countries was that they didn't develop export capabilities as much as the Asians. And whenever the economy started growing, you hit the balance of payment constraints. Because as a developing country, in order to develop, you need to import machines and capital goods. But as soon as you begin to grow, you run out of foreign exchanges, and then you get into financial troubles. So these are actually quite strongly related aspects. education, education does help, but this is probably one area where basically the demand takes care of supply. If the factories need engineers, engineers will be produced. It's not like you first produce engineers and then launch your industry. And this is why so many medical doctors and economists from countries like Nigeria and the Philippines are working as taxi drivers and so on in other countries, because they haven't got appropriate jobs. So attributing all this to education is quite misleading. Education followed development rather than led development. Just think about it. That if Brazil suddenly increased the university enrollment by 3 times without doing anything else, is it going to make Brazil richer? I don't think so. Anyway, let's take some more questions.
First of all, I like it very much what you said. And probably I'll agree with almost everything that you said. But I have a question which is actually methodological, but it has also importance on the real aspects, geopolitical aspects of the period. What you call to come back to go back to the development theory based on production structure, it needs a corollary, which means, do you have examples historically that behaved in that way? Probably you will have. My question is, what they have in common? What the examples that you will give, what they have in common according to the features that you define as a good development theory. So which are the examples and what they have in common?
Yeah.
Well, I have a small question about a strategy, economic strategy for large and small countries. Okay, for large countries such as Brazil, protectionism works. You need something more, but it works. And for small countries, it's a little bit different. How will you consider the experience of economic integration in relationship, particularly for small countries?
Yeah.
I have a small question also about tariffs. You're talking about in the paper how developed countries used protectionism and tariffs to develop their industries, and in a different context now, what would happen if most of developing countries started using tariffs to protect their industries, if that would have the same effect for those in a global trading economy, a lot of countries protecting their industries?
Hi. In a lot of works of yours, you say that Liszt was an influence on your work. Liszt has a specific view on Latin America and the tropical areas, and it's not very happy.
Yeah.
He says that they should specialize in agriculture in those areas.
He was a racist, yeah.
Yeah, even so, my question is, in your view, is it possible that every country achieve a developed status in our capitalist system? Or do we need those developing countries and the underdeveloped countries? Thank you.
Right, yeah, let's respond to those and maybe take another round if there's time. Yes, what's the commonalities across success stories? I mean, of course, in the exact types of industries they develop, exact policies they use in order to develop those industries and their political economy and institutions. I mean, they were all different. But I would say the common thing is that they always try to get into activities where there was a large scope for productivity growth and where productivity was growing fast. So, in the 18th century, when Britain was trying to catch up with the industrially more developed countries, low countries, that is what are Belgium and the Netherlands today, woolen manufacturing, woolen textile was the high-tech industry. When Japan and Korea were trying to catch up, electronics and cars were the high-tech industry, and they had to. Of course, they had to initially start with textile, but they knew that they had to get in there, and then in order to make this possible, you need that long-term financial commitment. So it took the Japanese 40 years of protection and subsidization to make companies like the Toyota world class. That's right, yeah. So basically getting into areas where there's fast productivity growth and making a long-term commitment. So that's the common theme. But when it comes to the actual practice, then we go to this issue of things like size. Countries like the U.S., China, Brazil, large countries, yes, they can afford quite high tariffs, and the negative effects tariff has both positive and negative effects, and for large countries, positive effects clearly dominate negative effects. But if you are Jamaica with 3 million people, or Estonia, that's right, Uruguay, 3 million, Estonia, 1.5 million people, it's very difficult to have that kind of protection, which means that you will have to have a more open economy, which then has implications about your labor market and your technology support and a lot of different things. Also, if you are small, you have to specialize more, which means that you are going to be more vulnerable to external shocks. For example, when the dot-com boom burst in the United States in 2001, the economy of Singapore contracted by 9% because they were highly specialized in electronics. South Korea didn't suffer as much because it is a major electronics producer, but it's a larger economy, and therefore it also has automobile, it also has shipbuilding, it also has steel and so on. So you have to accept that. And if you're going to be exposed to that kind of large external shocks, then you need to have different types of macroeconomic policy, different types of stabilization policy, and so on. If you are smaller, you will have to begin to export earlier, even if you use some degree of protection, because unless you export, you are not going to achieve scale economy. So how do you, this is why, for example, Korea and Taiwan use a lot of export subsidies, because they knew that they had to achieve a certain scale before they can become competitive. And in the early stage, how do you achieve that? You basically give money for companies to export, even if they on paper make losses. So yes, things like size have very different implications, and political economy, institutions. So the actual details are very different, but commitment to getting into high productivity growth sectors and long-term commitment, I think they are the two common themes. Now, I think this partly covered the question on how you use protection today. Now, there is, of course, today an added dimension, because a lot of international trade is actually intra-firm trade. So that on at one level, that it would be captured as Thailand export to Japan, but in fact, it might be a subsidiary of Toyota in Thailand sending some parts to Japan at the price that was not decided by the market, but decided by Toyota headquarters in Japan. And this kind of intra-firm trade, depending on which estimate you look at, account for between 1/3 and 1/2 of international trade.